Eurosport.
Hello and welcome to Eurosport's live coverage of the 1992 Grand Prix season. John Watson and Ellard Kelf in Monaco for the 50th Monaco Grand Prix. Half an hour warm-up session, 11 o'clock till 11:30. And of course the race this afternoon, 78 laps, and a man on pole position for the 6th time this year and the 23rd time in his career is Nigel Mansell. And John, again, another outstanding qualifying performance from Nigel and the whole Williams team.
Well, it was a real blinder. Nigel got that lap in towards the end of the session. In fact, nobody saw him doing it. Unfortunately, the cameras were following other cars, and suddenly it popped up on our Tag Heuer Olivetti screens, and we looked at it in disbelief. We thought it should be 2 minutes 19 or something, but 1 minute 19, and unbelievably fast. The quickest lap ever around any Monaco circuit. In fact, the first man to break the 80-second barrier here, and I can assure you, Alan Prost, who was sitting beside me throughout that session, when he saw it, shook his head in disbelief. To do that kind of time in these current Formula One cars on the Monaco circuit, superhuman effort from Super Nige.
Nigel Mansell, the only man to qualify faster than last year's pole position time. Next to him on the front row, the man who will start his 229th Grand Prix, who made his debut here in 1977 and won his very first Grand Prix here in 1982, 10 years ago. That's Riccardo Patrese. Ayrton Senna will line up on the second row of the grid. And John, you said yesterday the McLaren looked a bit of a handful, but Ayrton was on form and probably is on form.
Well, in fact, Gerhard Berger, likewise, the pair of them, the McLaren drivers, pushing very, very hard indeed, as is the team, to really come to terms with this MP47. I know that Ron Dennis refuses to accept that the car cannot be competitive. It's just outside of any thinking at all in his mind that they can't get that car to run at the front and ahead of those Williams. But in Monaco, we saw both Senna and Berger lose control of their cars in an attempt to wrestle that pole and front row position away from those two incredibly fast and stable Williams Renaults.
Both cars being damaged, but only superficial damage. Another man who had a spin was Jean Alesi, manhandling his Ferrari around the bumps and corners here in Monaco. Michael Schumacher will line up directly behind Jean Alesi and just in front of teammate Martin Brundle. 6th and 7th, the Benettons, and they could be a force to be reckoned with early in the race.
Well, I talked to Martin Brundle this morning, and he was saying that they had a lot of problem to get the car to work well in a qualifying setup. But he said, watch us in the race. The car is absolutely brilliant on full tanks. And of course, that's what Formula One is all about. Pole position and the front row of the grid in Monaco is an important position. But if they can get those two Benettons to work the way Martin's anticipating in the race, well, I would suggest that Schumacher and Brundle could be the sleepers. Maybe not for victory, but certainly for a podium position.
Slowest driver of the big four teams, McLaren, Williams, Benetton and Ferrari, is Ivan Capelli, lining up 8th on the grid. And then I think a very good performance from Johnny Herbert. The Lotus 107, it's a very new car. We saw in qualifying, well, especially Mika Häkkinen's car, it was jumping around a lot, but like Nigel Mansell, Johnny had one lap and just slotted the car into 9th position.
Well, Allard, you only need that one lap to get your grid position. And of course, for Lotus, this new car with its semi-active suspension, not quite as technically advanced as what we have seen in the Williams, but certainly the team really using these qualifying sessions as almost a glorified test session. And I would anticipate after this Grand Prix, then we go to Canada 2 weeks' time. But when the teams come back from that one flyaway race in the middle of the season and back into the real heart of Formula One, which is then the mid-European season, we can expect to see more and more progress from Lotus as they get to understand the car and as the drivers begin to understand how to convey that information and react to the car's handling. Active ride cars, I assure you, do not handle like conventionally sprung cars. There's not quite the same amount of feel, and that is partly why I believe that Nigel Mansell is mastering the handling of the Williams probably more comfortably than Riccardo Patrese is. Riccardo's a driver who tends to drive a car very much on the message he gets through his hands, his feet, in fact through the seat of his pants. Nigel doesn't need that information, he just goes quick.
Well, and quick he does. And Riccardo Patrese, I earlier said he was starting his 229th Grand Prix. Of course, it's his 230th Grand Prix, an enormous amount, and I doubt whether that record will ever be broken. Nigel Mansell, the first man out on the circuit, and you could say he's very, very eager. And the big question is now, how many litres of fuel is Williams running in their car?
Well, they certainly ran full, or the amount of fuel they require throughout the morning, Saturday morning session. And at that point, they were still 4th or 5th quickest. And other people certainly ahead of them may not have had maximum fuel distance allowance on board. So, in fact, one has to assume that Patrese and Mansell have got this race all but won at this particular point of the proceedings. But Monaco is a unique race. The conditions here are unlike anywhere else in the world. Even Adelaide, the only other street race in the calendar these days, much more like a conventional racetrack. This is racing in the streets of the tiny principality of Monaco. And I tell you, I mean, just driving around in a normal road car is difficult enough, but the stress on gearboxes, the brakes, the physical and mental stress, all those contribute to mechanical unreliability. And of course, we tend to see the highest mechanical failure rate here in Monaco over the course of those 78 laps.
Well, there's another factor to be reckoned with, which is something we've had over the past couple of days. The weather was nice and pleasant, the temperatures were nice and pleasant in the morning, but then in the afternoon came the rain.
Yes, it rained very heavily indeed. It didn't affect the qualifying, fortunately, but it did come around about 4 o'clock, and of course the Formula 3 race, incidentally won by Marco Werner in a rout. That race started in damp conditions. The conditions then dried out, and fairly unspectacular Formula 3 race on Saturday afternoon. But everybody here looking forward to a dry Grand Prix, and certainly Nigel Mansell on pole position would not want to see a wet race.
Well, for the moment, it's very quiet out on the track. Ayrton Senna just about to go out. What he will do on full tanks, we will find out here on Eurosport. Join us after the break for live coverage of the morning warm-up here in Monaco.
Eurosport.
Back here at Monaco, back with Jean Alesi, and I think the most spectacular inboard camera pictures will come from the little Frenchman and his Ferrari.
Well, it's not just from inboard they'll be spectacular all around the circuit. And Jean Alesi, we know, is so very quick from the lights red to green. And of course, again, back in 1990, the man was electric. We had we had 2 starts in Monaco because of an incident down in the Mirabeau, partly involving Jean Alesi. Remember when Alain Prost got involved just coming down to this part of the circuit. Alesi dived down the inside and confusion reigned, cars stopped, blocking the track. We had a restart, and Jean Alesi went on to finish second in a truly remarkable drive from somebody of sort of little experience at that time. Well, Jean Alesi's done a lot, right over the curbs. Has done a lot of growing up since 1990, and now in 92 at Ferrari, unquestionably the #1 driver in that team, and pushing very, very hard to try and get this current, looking for a space down the inside. Well, that's not the place to do it. Certainly not that far back.
Well, it's interesting, this picture, John, because Michele Alboreto, right in front of Jean Alesi, is just as quick, if not maybe a little quicker than Jean, and he's not going to get out of the way. And Alesi is quicker than the fastest time so far, which is held by Mika Häkkinen, a 1:29.973, a full 10 seconds slower than pole position time. Of course, times will be slower.
And just look at Alesi's hands. They're all over the look up, opposite locking it, coming through that little kink, coming onto the start-finish straight. For the performance of the V10 Mugen Honda engine in the Footwork, probably a match for the V12 Ferrari. And the difference between the 2 cars probably fairly small in terms of overall speed around the circuit. The differential is going to come from Jean Alesi versus Michele Alboreto. And of course, Michael Schumacher tagging on now to the back of those to make a little trio. And look, Schumacher looking to come down the inside, having done so fairly cleanly. In fact, Alesi deciding to give up.
Well, I think, John, this is a perfect picture to illustrate how difficult it is to overtake on this circuit and how opportunist Michael Schumacher is.
Well, in fact, both cars, Alesi and Alboreto, allowed Schumacher to go through. Believe me, if that was a racing situation, you wouldn't be any of this after you then. Thank you very much. So Alesi and Alboreto deciding to let Schumacher continue on his way. They're looking for clear laps. They just want to get about 3 clear laps in. They don't want to put too much load into the tyres with having to race somebody at this point of the proceedings. And of course, your tyre choice, although there's only one compound, but the particular set of tyres you use, again, a very critical factor in a street race. You want to find a set of tyres that is consistent, and you don't want to run them too hard either. You want to allow them to come up to temperature, then slow down again, not get too much temperature into the surface of the tyre, which then could lead to potential blistering or graining. And that, of course, would mean a set would be virtually of no use whatsoever. Well, this is Michael Schumacher now going through Saint-Devoux. This is a climb up the long and very steep climb. The camera doesn't really give you any indication just to how steep that climb is. Over the crest into the first part of this Casino Square sequence, then right, 4th gear, then downhill, coming into Mirabeau corner, down to 3rd gear, tight around that, then down into the 2nd gear, Lowe's hairpin bend. This is very slow. You sometimes see cars hook the rear wheel over that curve, and then the car leaps out to the left, and finally onto the Portier, which is onto the quickest part of the circuit, through the tunnel, exiting around about 170 miles an hour and race trim. And that's hard on the brakes into this very, very slow left, right, left chicane that was put in a number of years ago. A change from the original chicane, which became really just too quick indeed, with Grand Prix cars going through something like 4th gear, 140 miles an hour, and deemed eventually to be just too unsafe. So that was the answer, a very, very slow, tight and fiddly chicane. The drivers are now fairly comfortable with it.
Schumacher coming up behind Christian Fittipaldi. Michael, who is fastest at the moment on a 1:27.487, but time he will beat fairly easy, I would say, at 25.162, and that makes him, well, more than 2 seconds faster than anyone else. And the other person in 2nd place at the moment is Martin Brundle. And as you said, John, this morning, Martin Brundle, who told you that the cars are absolutely brilliant in race trim.
Well, Allard, brilliant wasn't the word he used, but they were pretty good anyway. And of course, racing drivers, they're always very cautious in the language that they use to describe a car. If they come out with words, adjectives such as that, and then of course it doesn't quite work for them in the race, they've left themselves with a bit of egg on their face. But certainly the two Benettons working extremely well in a full tank configuration. And I think the quiet confidence I saw in Martin Brundle's face this morning said really all that you need to say, and he will look forward to picking up more points from his point of view. Michael Schumacher looking forward to finishing a Grand Prix again, and let's say covering up the memory of the disappointment of Imola, when through a fault, no fault other than that of his own, he made a mistake and ended up on the tower wall, and that was the first non-finish we'd had from Michael Schumacher in the 1992 season.
Schumacher coming through the Rascasse section, and then it's on to the main straight again, and we've seen two relatively free laps of Michael Schumacher. This one I doubt will be faster than his fastest lap so far, because he was slower all through the lap. Again, climbing up to Mirabeau, and we haven't really seen the two Williams out yet. Nigel Mansell was the first man out on the circuit. He did a couple of laps, and now it's Jean Alesi. Jean Alesi, who just taken 2nd place of Martin Brundle.
This is a part of the circuit coming up the hill, very, very quick indeed, about 155, 160 miles an hour on the brakes at the crest, and coming through Casino Square. Well, that's a slightly slower lap, in fact, from Alesi. He's not at full racing speed. Again, going back to Martin Brundle, Allard, he was talking about these semi-automatic gearboxes, the fingertip gear change, let's call it that Ferrari, McLaren and Williams have. And Martin is really convinced now that if you don't have that kind of gear change, and particularly on this kind of circuit, you have got a time disadvantage. Well, Alesi's going to do a standing start. Let's have a look at this. Has he got traction control there? I would have thought that was a pretty nifty start from Alesi. He got the right amount of wheel spin, the car shot off, and well, that's the benefit of traction control. Again, a piece of equipment that Ferrari have been developing for a number of years. Williams have got it as well. McLaren are not owning up to it, but I suspect they've got something in their car which they may not call traction control, but in effect does a very similar thing.
Riccardo Patrese just finishing his first flying lap of the morning, a 1:27.764, puts him in the top 5. But it's the Benettons at the moment still on top. Schumacher and Brundle, then Jean Alesi. Riccardo Patrese is 4th, then Ivan Capelli 5th, Michele Alboreto 6th, Eric Coma 7th, JJ Leto 8th, Christian Fittipaldi 9th, and Stefano Modena is 10th. Modena had a torrid time in qualifying. He was 9th fastest during the morning session yesterday, but had all sorts of problems during the afternoon. And he feels very confident about the race. He says it's all about just finishing here. He said 2 years ago, just 5 cars finished the race, actually, driving around. He said, so anything can happen.
Well, I'm glad Stefano takes that view of racing at Monaco, because like every Grand Prix driver here today, the 26 people that are starting, they all know that as well. But when they start the race, they seem to forget about it. And Monte Carlo, the Grand Prix of Monaco, is one of those Grand Prix that it is difficult to finish in. And certainly in the first half of the race, if you're not in the front 2 or so rows of the grid, really all you need to do is just try to keep in touch, but not really get terribly involved in racing with somebody else. In the second part of the race, things begin to change. Unreliability, driver fatigue, errors creep in, and then that's the chance for you to make up those positions. It's a race about patience and prudence.
Riccardo Patrese, his next lap, we haven't seen him yet actually on screen, is 1:25.361. That puts him 2nd behind Schumacher at the moment. Martin Brundle is pushed back to 3rd. Ayrton Senna is at the moment in 11th place. And also I'm just looking for the Ligiers. Eric Comas being pushed back to 12th at the moment, and Ligier having a very bad time, we must say. And Frank Durney saying yesterday, well, the problem really is we don't really know what the problem is.
Well, I think Frank Durney was giving you a bit of an anecdotism there. That's one of those things that an engineer rarely is heard to say, certainly not publicly. And in fact, normally engineers always know what the case is, what the problems are. Just we can't quite get to terms with it right here. But when we go back to our base, we're going to do a bit of testing. We've just got the latest bit of suspension or aerodynamic that we want to fit to the car, and that will make all the difference. And for Frank to come around and say something like that is, and particularly from Frank, who's fairly loquacious, he's one of the more talkative designers in Formula One. Give him a microphone, he'll go on for hours and hours and hours. So the Ligier team really having a very difficult season and not really being able to find the kind of performance that their Renault engine teammates, or let's say engine user Williams, can find. So a lot of work. And of course, with the French Grand Prix coming up at Monaco, which is the base for the Ligier team, they will really want to do something rather special there.
Right behind Ayrton Senna, we're looking at Bertrand Gachot, and I think we can say Gachot had a very good weekend, apart from the last qualifying session yesterday when he had a little argument with Riccardo Patrese.
Yeah, it's just coming out of the chicane. We see Bertrand exiting the chicane. Well, yesterday afternoon, Patrese was on a hot lap. He came up behind Gachot on a bit of a misunderstanding. Gachot held him up on the exit, not terribly badly, I have to say, but of course it just destroyed the momentum that Patrese had built up. And then for the remaining part of the lap, Riccardo gave him a sequence of brake tests just to check Gachot's reactions. What went on, really, we're not entirely clear, but the outcome was that Riccardo Patrese was so upset he got out of his car, went up to Gachot, who was still in his car, and gave him 3 substantial whacks on the helmet. And according to Gachot, he then tried to open the visor to get inside that and sort his eyes out, because he hadn't been looking in his mirror. He wanted to maybe refocus his eyesight, but anyway, both drivers were taken away in front of the stewards and given a dressing down. So told to calm down and behave like Grand Prix drivers. Bertrand wasn't very pleased because he felt he was somewhat victimized. Well, I suppose Bertrand might say that anyway.
Well, Bertrand can be a little bit happier this morning. He's in 8th place at the moment.
Just watching, I saw a few laps earlier, the McLaren coming out of Poitiers, and again on this lap, just a big cloud of smoke as he was getting back on at Senna's car. As he was getting back on the throttle after accelerating out of the Poitiers corner, a cloud of blue smoke coming from the back of the car. That might just be something like a little bit of oil and the overflow tank getting onto something warm, but certainly that's 2 laps now that I've seen that.
Schumacher still being the quickest on the 1:25.162. Then it's Riccardo Patrese on the 1:25.361. Nigel Mansell at 26.088, and Martin Brundle is fourth with a 1:26.127. Ayrton Senna is currently in fifth, Ivan Capelli sixth, Michele Alboreto again in the top 10 in seventh, Stefano Modona's eighth, Bertrand Gachot 9, and Jean Alesi is in 10th spot. But this is an interesting picture. We see Michael Schumacher slightly running away from Ayrton Senna, who might have sort of given up the chase, actually.
Well, I suspect that Schumacher's car is not running with the fuel that he will start the race on. It's quite possible that they're doing what they did in Imola, and that's run with 2/3 fuel, which is not a great deal of fuel here in Monaco, because it's a short race in terms of distance, longish race in terms of times. Well, it is in fact the slowest Grand Prix in the calendar. More likely Martin Brundle is running with the fuel he will start the race on, and of course watching Schumacher accelerate up the hill from Saint-Devoux with a lighter fuel load, the acceleration will be that much quicker.
Schumacher being 0.2 of a second slower than his best at the moment. Ayrton Senna following. If we look at the times at the moment, we see Mika Häkkinen in 10th place at the moment, just in front of Andrea de Cesaris. That means that the Lotus is going well again in this morning warm-up. But the Lotus, another of the Ford HB engine users, so another one that's got an advantage with the weight.
The weight is certainly much lower for those teams with the Ford engine. And again, Lotus, I suspect, in spite of the very good performance you saw yesterday, they're still somebody going down the escape road. Probably the team not running the car on full tanks. They're more concerned with learning as much as they can about the car, and maybe having to add in another 8 or so 10 gallons to give the car fuel distance. Well, they're going to live with that, but they're really trying to find out as much as they can about the car in a trim in which the car will be for most of the part of the race in.
Well, the top 8 on your screen, with Schumacher still on top, Riccardo Patrese being in second, but Mika Häkkinen slotting up to 7th place, and Bertrand Gachot in 6th. So it's all anybody's guess, I suppose, who's running what sort of fuel, but they're not doing bad.
Well, I think we're going to see two distinct races. We're going to see the two Williams at the front really sort of getting up and going. And then behind that, you've got the McLarens, the Ferraris, the Benettons. And then behind that, then you've got people like Gachot, Johnny Herbert, Mika Häkkinen, Alboreto, De Cesaris, possibly Stefano Modena and Gugelmin in the Jordan Yamahas. The midfield is going to be it's going to be a train. In fact, it's going to be difficult to overtake. We're going to see maybe 8 or 10 cars all running around sequentially. And it'll be the one that doesn't make the mistake that'll get there at the end.
Schumacher is going to improve on that. No, he's not. He's just over the best time, and Martin Brundle did improve, and Ayrton Senna has taken top spot now on a 1:25.16.
Again, Allard, coming out of Saint-Devoux, Ayrton Senna's engine is blowing out oil smoke.
Schumacher bumped back to second. Brundle is back in third. Riccardo Patrese now in fourth. Gachot has moved up to 6th place. Fifth place. Mansell is in 6th. And Häkkinen is in 7th.
Again, look at the smoke coming out from the two McLarens now. One at the Senna's car. And watch it coming down through the portiere. And if you can see again, look, that oil, telltale signs.
Well, are they going to have a busy time? I think the McLaren boys are. We're going to find out after the break here on Eurosport. Welcome back here live on Eurosport for the warm-up for this afternoon's Monaco Grand Prix, the 50th running of that Grand Prix. And John, if we just look at our computer, look who's gone on top.
Surprise, surprise, Michele Alboreto in the Footwork Mugen Honda. Well, I shouldn't say surprise, surprise, because again, this is the 3rd Grand Prix, we've seen very, very strong progress coming from the Footwork team. Going back 2 weeks, of course, in Imola, I think Michele Alboreto ended up being 2nd quickest, and at that point, he did run the spare car, and he was running on a small amount of fuel. The yellow flag's being waved just at the exit of Saint-Devoux. We see a green flag. Statically, that means the track is clear, but we really can't see the reason why. Whether it was Christian Fittipaldi or somebody else, the flag certainly waved vigorously on the right-hand side as well as on the left-hand side. But the static green flag on that foreground in the left means the track now is clear. And there, all the Honda engineers diving into the back of Ayrton Senna's Honda V12 engine. They've just put the engine cover back on again.
Well, Ayrton still in that second place. Alboreto fastest. Jean Alesi is third. Michael Schumacher is fourth. Martin Brundle fifth. Riccardo Patrese is in sixth place. Then Mika Häkkinen, Nigel Mansell 8th, Stefano Modena 9th, and Bertrand Gachot 10th. Well, that's...
And there's the man who is currently quickest, Michele Alboreto, coming up behind Eric Comas. And let's just hope we can watch these two. There's the car stopped, and that's why we couldn't see it. The car stopped on the right-hand side at the exit of Saint-Devoux. Well, Alboreto backed off when he saw those flags. There's no point in pursuing Comas round a lap. Comas running somewhat slower in the 1:27 bracket against the 25s of Michele Alboreto. Luigi Martini and Johnny Morbidelli. Pierluigi had that enormous accident in the tunnel on Saturday morning. Now that's rather naughty, Jean Alesi. You passed it under the yellow flags. Someone might have seen that. Maybe Peter Ward, the piste steward, and might decide yet again to bring that irrepressible little Frenchman from Avignon via Sicilian ancestry in and explain them the facts of Formula One life. You don't pass under waved yellow flags.
Well, Alesi being pretty experienced in bringing up novel excuses. Ayrton Senna going back out, and I think the question is now, do we still see that blue smoke? It became worse and worse, but it seemed to be gone now, and that's Mika Häkkinen who stopped with the Lotus. And I think that's a very sad sight for the man who's currently 7th fastest. He looks at the car and I think it's just stopped.
Well, there we have it. And it's not Nigel Mansell at the top of the list, it's Riccardo Patrese. Riccardo Patrese has just established the quickest time so far in this 30-minute unofficial warm-up session. 1:23.959, a full 1.1 seconds quicker than Michele Alboreto. And really, I have to say, there's no big surprise in that. We anticipated, well, both the Williams being at the top of the list this morning. Riccardo Patrese certainly has planted his car well and truly at the top of the list. And this is Ivan Capelli coming through Casino, through the left-hand part of the Casino. And here is the advantage. You can see the advantage of that semi-automatic gear change. If you watch, you might see his fingertips activate the switch behind the steering wheel, which changes gear. And it is this advantage that Martin Brundle begins to think. Well, they think that the Benetton is losing time in a lap, partly because of that, certainly partly because of active ride suspension, but because you can keep both hands on the wheel, and that is an advantage, especially when your rivals have got it.
Less than a minute to go in this warm-up session for the Grand Prix this afternoon, which will be held over 78 laps. Riccardo Patrese 1.1 second faster than anybody else. Then it's Michele Alboreto, Ayrton Senna, Jean Alesi, Nigel Mansell, and the two Benettons being in 6th and 7th place. The race, which will start at 3:30 local time, which is 2:30 in the UK. But Andrea de Cesare is going quicker. He's moved up to 10th place. And John, it's sort of what we've seen yesterday as well. Everybody doing similar sorts of times, and then suddenly this Williams come past and it's a second quicker.
Well, we've got in second place Michele Alboreto in a 1:25.040, and the last time in the 1:25 second bracket is Stefano Modena, 1:25.910, and he's now actually dropped down to 12th place, so 11 cars covered by a single second, and that is the heart of the Grand Prix here this afternoon.
Well, Riccardo Patrese finished the morning warm-up fastest, I would say, because Nigel Mansell finished his last lap and he's not top of the list. Nigel Mansell only 5th fastest, and I think that's the worst position Mansell's been in this year. I mean, before it was second, and that was in Mexico when Riccardo Patrese was fastest again. Michele Alboreto again second, I should say. Ayrton Senna third, Jean Alesi fourth, and Nigel Mansell, as said, in 5th.
Well, I have to imagine that all this panic about Nigel Mansell not being quickest of any session at any Grand Prix I'm sure really will be very ill-founded. I'm quite positive, as we have seen with Riccardo Patrese with that 1 minute 23.595 second lap, that Nigel Mansell's car is more than capable of doing a similar time. But Nigel, I'm sure, probably just maybe, well, not wanting to appear to be overly confident, but he is on pole position, and I can guarantee you one thing: when those lights go to green, he's going to be up and off, and if anybody sees him, it'll be Riccardo Patrese. As for the rest, well, they will make the entertainment in the afternoon, but the two Williams in a class of their own here around the streets of Monte Carlo.
If we quickly go through the top 20, Patrese, Alboreto, Senna, Alesi, Mansell, the top 5. Then the two Benettons, Schumacher and Brundle, 2/10 apart. Then it's Mika Häkkinen in 8th, Gerhard Berger in 9th, and Andrea de Cesaris in 10th. Capelli and Modena 11 and 12, Gasio, Guzmin, Morbidelli, Martini, Herbert, Brouillard, Leto and Gomez. That's the 20 fastest drivers here in Monaco this morning. This afternoon we'll be back for 78 laps round the streets of Monaco. John Watson and Elad Kyle, thank you for watching and see you later. Bye bye.
Eurosport.